Hello, in this video, I want to start off the final little segment of what we'll be doing for the Accelerationism videos. I've really enjoyed doing this series so far, and hopefully you've enjoyed watching it for whatever parts you have watched it. If this is your first time tuning into the series, I would definitely suggest watching some of the earlier videos that I've done, like the intro to Accelerationism, or just any of the videos that I've done recently talking about like how Accelerationism gets executed as an affirmative strategy and what my thoughts are about it on the upcoming water resolution, because a lot of the thoughts that I'll be having in this video like come directly from that, because these two sets of videos are just about how to answer accelerationist abs on the upcoming resolution, and so having a lot of context to just like what I mean by accelerationism as a whole and what I'm referring to, and then thinking about a lot of the stuff that I think I talked about were like some of the strengths or the ways that I think that the team that's reading accelerationism can really frame the debate in a way that's like really potent and advantageous for them. I think it's kind of like a lot of the structuring questions that'll go into like how I'm framing a lot of this video, and so make sure that you tune into that in order to get a lot of the context for the stuff that I'll be talking about here. For this video, I want to start off just talking about what I think are some of the places where I think every strategy can really find a place to deal with accelerationism, and what I think just like some general good practices are against it as an argument. And then I kind of want to go through and talk about like how teams, whether you're reading like case arguments, framework arguments, K arguments, counterplans, and dissads, what I just generally think the best form of these arguments are against these types of affirmatives, in order for you to just get a better idea of what I'm thinking about strategically as a whole. And hopefully it'll be a good way to just end out this series as it's kind of come for all 12 of these parts. So basically what I think are some of the big priorities that any team that's answering an argument where they see accelerationism is important is, first, I think you should always make the method deal with like the possibility of the existence of like right accelerationism, not as something they have to defend as endemic to the ideology of the 1AC, but something that exists as part of the possibility of the transition from the way in which we use and think about like technology and stuff now onto like what it would look like to do it in the world of the alternative. I think that a lot of affirmatives will answer this question by just being like, we should just revolt against like capitalists as well, in line with the way that we reuse tech, and sort of like a lot of these things will happen by just like types of revolutionary action taken against those that or they're saying are kind of have a monopoly over tech now. But I definitely think that being able to talk about the way in which like right-wing accelerationism has been used in order to like justify or co-opt the ways in which like people kind of like create tenets or create central ideas or practices for left-wing accelerationism, and the way in which those ideologies have interacted historically is a really important thing to just make teams grapple with in general. And I think it'd at least be an interesting idea to get an interesting idea for what types of examples they'll kind of spot when they're left with arguments about just how people like contextually will respond to the presence of like a revolution such as the affirmative at all. I think that it's really important to push these types of questions, because it forces them to really deal with like finite examples that kind of deal with like central planning conditions that get towards the world of the affirmative, that I think that oftentimes a lot of teams skip the step with, and I think that you can just do a really good job of really holding them to it, and maybe creating room for like further insights that can help you later on in the debate. Additionally, I think that when you're trying to think about maybe some other weaknesses that those argument may have, or places where you should poke it, I think that making arguments about about the idea of like the inability of like of any type of institution or any type of organizing structure to really handle like a mass redistribution or a shift from like the way in which we think about technology now, and like the end result of that being like the increase of like privatized models where like various types of like even like communities or small sectors of like the population are kind of like taking up the kind of like usages of these technologies in ways that are like violent, or kind of stop the kind of like radical redistribution of those things, I think can be really important for forcing the affirmative to like defend a kind of more finite model of like what their organizing principle looks like, which I think can short circuit the ability of them to like blend into a lot of these arguments that I was kind of saying on the videos before about like how you can really open up this affirmative in order to have access to all these types of different features and tactics. I think that you can close down and limit the ability for them to really touch all of these things by forcing them to defend like what happens in various specific moments, and then holding the types of organizing principles that they use in those moments as a way to like keep them accountable for like various types of practices that you want to use as the basis for contesting them further on in the flow. I think when you transition this to like what are the case arguments that you should be reading, I think that the two things I cited above definitely work as some case arguments, but I also think that you need to definitely figure out what the basis you want to compete with for the impact model of the criticism, because I think that as an affirmative strategy, a strength of accelerationism is its ability to like, especially on the water resolution and the conversations that'll come this year about like the environment and stuff, to really weigh the impending doom that is the environment on the kind of like calculus that judges take up. And so I think that whatever advocacy or stance that whatever like flow that you go for takes should either have something to say about the relationship that the impact you have is to the environment and the way that the judge should be evaluating those things, or it should be like very clear the way in which your alternative takes a stance, or whatever, or like whatever methodology or type of like stance that you're taking, methodology against the affirmative has a way to resolve some of like the environmental aspects of what I think these 1ACs will really accompany, because I think that will really kind of create a lot of the way in which the judge kind of evaluates the like overall necessity or the overall value of whatever type of like political frame you're asking them to think under. I think that when you kind of transition this onto thinking a little bit about like the framework and T debate, it's really important to, I think, create an understanding or a way to frame the interpretation of the resolution that just explains that even if they're right about the future needing to be more open than the one that's kind of like currently allowed under the resolution, the idea that the interpretation should open up like endless mechanisms towards that doesn't actually resolve the problem of how we talk about and speak about the environment. Like, if you're right about like the impending doom or like the things that are coming in terms of the environment, it's even more important that we have like really precise conversations that are limited to like what types of solutions are like immediately accessible in order for us to like buy ourselves more time or make it possible for us to think about radically different ways of like relating ourselves to the world in order to kind of like create a way, something that is like more sustainable, even if it means a transition away from the current mechanisms that we have in the status quo. I think using your framework and T arguments to create creative ways that some of your standards can bring up conversations about how we can transition away from a model that is centered around the US, even if you kind of like need to use this year's resolution as a starting point for that conversation, could be a really interesting way that you kind of spin a lot of the arguments that I think the affirmative wants to pin you on in terms of like you trying to ontologize like how the state works in its like existence in the first place. I think that then once you do this, that the way in which you kind of like spin the debate back into your procedurals both work as an added net benefit to like any of the arguments that you're already winning on those bases, but it also means that in a world where you think about the framework and T debate closer to something like an impact turn debate, these types of standards where you're kind of winning the transition arguments serve as like terminal impact defense, with all of the procedural standards really serving as reasons for there to be particular offensive rejections of why the affirmative's interpretation kind of opens up a particular usage of the debate space that you're kind of like deeming as unethical or unfair to like how debate should operate. And I think that those are definitely a good set of arguments to kind of lay out in order to hedge back against some of the more structural arguments I think that this type of stance of arguments wants to make in terms of like what accelerationism brings to the table and how you should really be responding to it. Hopefully this video was helpful for you, and hopefully you'll tune into the last video that I'll be doing on this set of videos talking about accelerationism, because I really enjoyed doing them. And yeah, thanks.